inside, still trying to get Dr. Post to respond to urging. Saya's all over him with attachment rate, top of the lane. On the far outside attachment rate from between Dr. Post, Americanus digs deep toward the inside. Dr. Post now up for the lead. Attachment rate is second. Let there be no doubt who's best. It's Dr. Post, an even money winner.
All right, welcome back here on Racing Rundown. Today we got a preview of the Grade 1 Haskell Invitational from Monmouth Park this week in a really fun race. 100 points on the line for the Kentucky Derby, and also a Breeders' Cup Classic win in your in tag. So obviously, you know, the Haskell normally has the Breeders' Cup Classic tag, so if that wasn't enough to make the Haskell must-see event, then the 100 points toward the Kentucky Derby for the winner adds to that watch value for the Haskell. And it's the typical 140, 20, 10 that the usual late series preps for the Kentucky Derby are normally. So the 7 horses are going to go to the post in this race. I'll go through the field really quickly. Number 1 is Dr. Post, 2 is Authentic, 3 is Jesus' team, 4 is Ancient Warrior, 5 is Fame to Famous, 6 is Lebda, and 7 is New York Traffic. And I'll start off with the number 1 horse in this race, Dr. Post, and, you know, there's some really high caliber second tier, if you want to call them 3-year-olds. I think second tier doesn't necessarily do Dr. Post a lot of justice because he is a really, really nice 3-year-old. And another example of a horse that, had we had a Kentucky Derby in May, this would not have been a horse that would have been on anybody's radar or would have even had a chance to make it to the Kentucky Derby, being that he started his 3-year-old season very late. He did race once as a 2-year-old, but didn't race after that race that he had at Belmont on 4th of July weekend 2019 until he most recently broke his maiden at Gulfstream Park, and then since then has gone on to run 2 really nice races in stakes company. He won the Unbridled Stakes down at Gulfstream, and then he had the very validating second place effort behind Tizelaw on the Belmont Stakes, 3.5 lengths beaten against the horse that's definitely the best 3-year-old in the United States right now. There's no shame in running second to him, and he beat some really solid horses in this race, or in that Belmont Stakes, I should say. And one other note is that if you're following some of the other races that are coming up this week and into this weekend, pay attention to how the Peter Pan Stakes turns out, specifically with regards to Modernist, because a couple other horses in this race have run races against Modernist. Dr. Post is one of them, and then the New York Traffic, the 7, who we will get to later on in this video, but they've run races behind Modernist. So if Modernist wins the Peter Pan or runs a really bang-up race, then the stock for both Dr. Post and New York Traffic goes up. But going back to Dr. Post as the horse, you know, he's one of the best, if not the best, second-tier 3-year-old, and if he wins a race like this, he definitely elevates himself into that top tier. And I will spoil it right now, he is going to be my top pick. I do take a lot of heat because I do go with favorites, but I think that Dr. Post, you know, you look at his 3 races this year, I don't really take his one start as a 2-year-old into account. 2 wins and a second, and that second was behind the best horse, or at least the best 3-year-old in the United States. So there's not really anything to knock Dr. Post on. The 2 is Authentic, and a lot of people are going to like Authentic in this race because he is trained by Bob Baffert, and Bob Baffert does have a very long history of success in this race, so it makes a lot of sense for Authentic to be able to continue that. If you look at the last times that Baffert has had a runner in this race, he didn't have runners in 17 or 18, but of the Haskell races that have been run since 2010, Bob Baffert has had the winner or a second place finisher in every edition of the Haskell, with the exception of the 2 that he did not have horses running in 2017 and 18. So obviously history is on the side of Authentic, but I really think that that's the only thing that's on the side of Authentic, and the reason that I think that is because he does have a lot of distance question marks with him. You know, you look at his pedigree and you obviously see Into Mischief, and anyone who knows a lot about pedigrees knows that Into Mischief horses are horses that tend to be really good around 7 furlongs to a mile, and you know it starts to get a little bit murky going up from that distance. He has won in a mile and a 16th before, and you know he did run a fairly credible second in his most recent start, the Santa Anita Derby, behind Honor AP, who a lot of people think is one of the really top 3-year-olds in the country. I'm not on that group, nor is my co-host Eric, but you know, if you really like Honor AP, you can talk yourself into liking this horse, Authentic, who ran second to him by only about a length and a half in that race. But I don't really think that race was a spectacular one for Honor AP like a lot of people do. I think that there's a lot of questions with Authentic in terms of his distance and how far he would be able to go. I don't think a mile and an eighth is out of the realm of possibility, but I don't think it's very likely that he gets it. But if he were to get a mile and an eighth, that would be as far as he would go. But as far as what I think of him in this race, I don't think he can get the distance. So Authentic is a pass for me. He will be close to the lead, if not the horse that's on the lead. So that is something to take into consideration. But I don't think he would be able to stay around for a mile and an eighth. The 3 is Jesus' team, and he's actually a very, very interesting horse. If you go back and look at, he's only got 2 career wins, but he does have 5 in the money finishes in his career. And if you go back to his last race, which was an allowance at Gulfstream on the 6th of June, he ran second behind Soli Volante in that race, and it was a very, very good closing second in that race. Obviously Soli Volante, you would say, is probably the best horse in that particular race, and he did finish ahead of S.A. Indienne, who won the Fountain of Youth and was a very good second in the Holy Bull behind Tis the Law, who we already talked about with Dr. Post. So, if you look at that back class, there's very good back class for Jesus' team, and he looks like a horse that is definitely one to keep your eye on underneath. I don't think he's the type of horse that would win a race like this, but for a second or a third or a fourth type of super filler, he would definitely be a horse that I would want to keep my eye on. The 4 Ancient Warrior is another one that I would say is really, really interesting. And if you look at his first 4 starts, you wouldn't necessarily think that he would get a race like this, 9 furlongs, a mile and an eighth, considering that his first 4 starts of his career were all at 6 furlongs, and then his most recent, which was an allowance at Churchill Downs, was 6.5 furlongs. So obviously you look at that and you see the archetype of a sprint horse. But you look at his first 4 races, and all of those were run with him on the lead. So that could be very deceiving if you only look at those 4 races. But if you look at his most recent race, which was the race that was 6.5 furlongs at Churchill Downs, they took him back off the lead, and they had him close into that race, and he closed very nicely to get 3rd in that particular race. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm confident that he would be able to close into a race like this. I don't know necessarily that he would be able to get the distance because he hasn't gone this far. And it's not like he's gone 7 furlongs or a mile. He would be jumping into this race off of a most recent 6.5 furlong race. But I would say if he does run the race very similar to his allowance at Churchill most recently where he was 3rd, then I would give him an outside chance to run well in this race. I'm very intrigued if that taking him back off and running him in a race like this, because it did also look like he was closing in that race. If you go back and watch it, if you're interested at all in this horse, I would highly suggest you do that. It looked like he wanted more in that race. So I think he's got an outside chance to be able to close well into this. His most recent efforts wouldn't necessarily suggest that, but I would say that this is a horse that I wouldn't necessarily overlook so easily. The next horse, the 5, is Fame to Famous, and he is one of the horses in this race that I was very iffy on. He has 9 career starts, only 1 win, but a 2nd and a 3rd also, so he does have 3 in the money finishes. But he's coming into this race off of only 1 career start on dirt prior to this. He's been running on grass exclusively outside of the Risen Star Stakes, one of the divisions that was won by Modernist, which in that race he was 11th. So the 1 start that he does have on dirt was not very good at all. So I would look at that and say that's automatically something that I look away from. And ultimately, I don't think, even if this horse does have some ability on dirt, which I'm not going to say that he doesn't, because his 1 start on dirt was in Stakes Company, but I wouldn't expect him to be able to step up and win his first start on dirt in a race like this. So for that, he was a toss for me. He looks like a grass horse. He does have the 1 career start on dirt that was not good. So pass over him for me. The 6 Lebda is another one of those horses that I would say is of the intriguing category. If you go back to early in his 2-year-old year, he was a very, very good 2-year-old. He won 2 or 3 races. He was 2nd in his first start out, and then he was 3rd in the Iroquois behind the race where Dennis's Moment freaked in the Iroquois, ran really well there. and has not run up to that form since. But after that race, he ran ninth in the Nashua. That was good enough for last place. But since then, he's gone to Laurel Park, and he's won 2 of 3 black types down at Laurel, and he was third in a third, which was a listed, but third in a stake at Laurel. Now, that doesn't necessarily suggest that this is going to be a really high caliber horse. Winning races at Laurel is not something that you would expect from a high level horse, and I don't really think Lebda is anyone that I would consider super talented. You go back and you go to his most recent race, which was in the Ohio Derby. I liked him a little bit. He wasn't my pick in that race, but he was 6th in the Ohio Derby, so that was his third race against, if you want to call it open company. It's not like the 2 black types that he won at Laurel were restricted, but his first race outside of Maryland since he lost to Nashua was a 6th place effort, so very unattractive for me. I don't think that Lebda is going to be able to go back to his 2-year-old form. If he were to somehow regain some of that, then maybe he would be a threat here. But I just don't think that's going to happen, so I'm going to leave him out here. The 7 is another horse that I would put in kind of the same category as Dr. Post. And New York Traffic is a sleeper, really consistent, really solid horse this year. You go back to the 4 starts that he's had this year. An allowance at Gulfstream, he won that race. He was third in the Risen Star behind Modernist and Major Fed. I mentioned with Dr. Post, keep an eye on the Peter Pan. If Modernist wins the Peter Pan, then I would definitely say you got to take a look at New York Traffic more seriously than you would have necessarily beforehand. Then following the Risen Star that he ran third, and he ran second behind Wells Bayou in the Louisiana Derby, and that was a very merry-go-round-esque race. He and Wells Bayou both circled the field and didn't really give anyone a chance to close into something. And his most recent start, the Matt Win, I think was probably his best race, and that was probably against the best horse he's run against, Maxfield, who, even though he does have the soundness issues and is not going to be able to run in the Kentucky Derby this year, Maxfield was probably one of the top, if not the top 3-year-old. I wouldn't go that far, but I know there are people who would. And, even if he isn't the best, Maxfield was top 2 or 3. And New York Traffic finished second to him by a length in the Matt Win. And even though Maxfield did have a really bad trip, and probably if he got a better trip would have run a little bit, or beat New York Traffic, I should say, by a little bit more, it was still a very, very good second place effort behind a horse that is one of the best 3-year-olds based on the one race that we saw from him this year. So New York Traffic has some really good back class. We're big on back class here on this show, and I would say Dr. Post probably has the best, but New York Traffic is very close behind him. New York Traffic could also get a very, very favorable trip in this race. He is a speed horse, like I mentioned, in the Louisiana Derby. He wasn't the horse that was on the lead the entire race, but he was stalking the pace really close, and he got a very slow pace to run into and kind of ran away with the race, at least the second place part of the race. So, if New York Traffic gets a good setup and doesn't necessarily have anyone challenging him for the lead, which challenge could come from a horse like Authentic, but I don't necessarily think, I would say Authentic is going to go out there itching for a speed duel. I would think that would exacerbate the distance question for Authentic even more. So New York Traffic could find himself alone on the lead, and if he finds himself alone on the lead, you better be careful of him, because he has run really well when he's been alone on the lead or alone in a position in a race. He usually doesn't relinquish that position. If you go back to his allowance at Gulfstream on the 11th of January, he went to the front, stayed there the entire time, didn't necessarily have, I wouldn't call it a slow pace, I'd call it fairly moderate in 1:11 and 3. That was definitely faster than in either of his 2 stakes, or 3 stakes races, I should say. Not that I'm judging his quality off an allowance race, but New York Traffic, definitely you got to look at him. I think he could get a very favorable pace setup, and he is dangerous in this race. Even though I don't think he's the best on class, he's definitely dangerous. And that brings me to my top 4 for this race. I already mentioned that Dr. Post is going to be the horse I'm going to take. I think he is a very, very high caliber 3-year-old. If he's not a low tier 1 horse, he's the highest rung of the tier 2 3-year-olds, and he's knocking on that door of being one of the top 3-year-olds in the country. So he's on top for me. I'm going to go with New York Traffic second, because I do think that he will get a very favorable trip, and I think he will definitely be tough to run by in the stretch, but I think that Dr. Post will be able to get past him at some point. I mentioned that Jesus' team is one of the horses that I really think is intriguing underneath. I'm going to have him third in this race. I think he'll be able to generate a good race underneath. And for fourth, I will throw in Authentic just because I don't think he can get this far. And I think that the horses that I have finishing ahead of him, New York Traffic, Dr. Post, and Jesus' team, are better than the horses that he was running in second in front of in the Santa Anita Derby. So that's how I see this weekend's running of the Haskell going. Thank you for stopping by. If you do decide to play this race, good luck, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
5 lengths off Authentic as the field turns for home. Honor AP is coming after Authentic. Authentic the leader. Honor AP chasing with determination, then storm the court there in the final furlong, and it's Authentic who's still very strong on the front end, and he pulls away with authority. Authentic is undefeated as he will romp in the San Felipe, a very easy 2.5 lengths.